And sorry about the delay for starting. We just had some technical difficulties, which we've now figured out. Some housekeeping first. This event is part of the Gender, Women and Sexuality Studies annual colloquium. And please look out for flyers about the other events in the colloquium series, particularly Carrie Baker from Smith College, who's visiting on April 8th, which is also a Friday at 1:30 p.m. And now I'd like to thank the people who made this event possible. Firstly, Annie Hill, who's co-chairing the colloquium committee with me. Where's Annie? Right there. Thank you. And who's really and also it's Annie's birthday. Happy birthday. And secondly, I'd like to thank Jigna Desai, who's the chair of GWIZ, and also Orbe, Walter, Cassie Miskin, and Jess Giusti, who are our administrative staff who made all the nuts and bolts of this happen, who are amazing. And then I want to thank our co-sponsors. So this is co-sponsored, and the venue is made possible by the Institute of Advanced Studies. And then also the program in Asian American Studies, the Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality Initiative, and the Departments of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature, American Studies, and Political Science co-sponsored today. So thank you to them. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Neferti Tadiar to the University of Minnesota. Neferti is the author of Things Fall Away, Philippine Historical Experience and the Makings of Globalization, Beyond the Frame, Women of Color and Visual Representation, co-edited with Angela Davis, and Fantasy Production, Sexual Economies, and Other Philippine Consequences for the New World Order, as well as articles in journals and anthologies that are too numerous to mention here. And Neferti is one of the scholars whose work to me comes from the future or comes from a place that pushes us and presses against the limits of existing language and concepts to think differently. And she brings us along as readers or as hearers today to also push ourselves to think differently. Her work shuttles between thinking through the problematics of domestic and intimate relations, in particular the gendered and racialized relations that emerge in colonial and neo-colonial settings, and the vast spatial and temporal logics of contemporary capitalism and globalization. And in the process, she reimagines the fields of postcolonial theory and transnational feminism, bringing to our attention what is lost, chaotic, decaying, or understood as wasted, and showing how politics and life forms take place in those realms. And I was really privileged to get a preview of, I think, some of the material that you're presenting today a couple of weeks ago, and I think you're in for a real treat, so I'd just like to welcome Neferti.
First of all, thank you, Aaron, for the kind invitation and that really kind introduction. It's always a privilege to get thoughtful introductions that are not your website. So thank you. Thank you to the chair of the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, Jigna Desai, and for the institutional hospitality, and Orbe Walter for making the arrangements. So today I thought I would share some of the work and thinking I've been doing that leads towards a feminist theory of forms of human media, as I promised, as exemplified by the use or actuation of humans as the instruments of other humans' will and expressive agency. How do I get to the first slide? I just press.
Arrow keys.
Yeah. My thinking about this can undoubtedly be traced to my earliest work on overseas Filipino domestic workers in the 1990s, and in particular this 1995 work by Filipino artist Imelda Cahipe and Daya, Ang asawa ko ay DH, or my wife is a DH, domestic helper, which I thought so movingly encapsulated the treatment of live-in migrant domestic workers, helpers as kasangkapan. At the time they were called domestic helpers. Kasangkapan, which is household utensils or tools, the effect of an objectification of subsistence labor or domestic work in and as the very instruments of subsistence or domestic work, such as the broom and iron, etc. Severed from any natural origin or natal belonging, she is a technological apparatus, an artificial organism, a replicant, designed to perform the reproductive work otherwise fulfilled by real wives, mothers, and daughters. There's more to say about this piece and the political context within which it was made to resonate, not least the Folkahipe and Daya's feminist critique of the figure and role of wife. I will just mention here the intense national uproar caused by the harrowing media reports of the physical and mental violence with which overseas domestic workers were treated in the homes where they worked in other countries. Psychological and physical torture, mutilation, sexual assault, rape, starvation, confinement, and murder. An uproar that brought the Philippine state and the nation into a moral, political, and economic crisis, precipitating a whole set of national legal reforms and international agreements, resulting in the reformation of the Philippine state into one of the most successful labor brokering states in the world, overseeing the deployment of between 12 to 15% of its population of more than 100 million as overseas or migrant labor, whose annual remittances this last year reaching $29.5 billion, is the third largest in the world following India and China. At the time, it was the figure and reality of slavery, gleaned in the conditions of overseas domestic workers in particular. What the papers were already calling then modern-day slavery, which you can see as part of the beginnings of current global abolitionist, anti-trafficking, and free the slave campaigns, that shaped the way the problem of overseas domestic labor was to be understood. My own attempt then was to understand the connections between these conditions of servitude and slavery, and to take this problematic seriously. The connections I argued, and I drew quite a bit on African-American feminist scholarship on slavery, particularly female slavery, but the connections I argued rested on the intersection of gender and racial systems of differentiation with the logic of commodity fetishism. That is to say, the racializing objectification of national, class, and gendered social relations of dispossession realized through acts of violence inflicted on the bodies of domestic workers, acts of violence that inscribe them as less and other than human, worthless things without subjectivity, in a historical moment of redefinition of humanity through globalization. So the acts of violence was the acts of inscribing them precisely in this racializing way. They were, after all, labor commodities in a burgeoning warm body export national economy, territorialized bodily resources of a developing or third world nation state whose own masculine sovereignty depended on its management of its feminine body. In this way, they were objectifications of an economic as well as a racial difference between their cost and their employer's worth, which was translated into appropriable surplus value. I understood the continuities between contemporary servitude and slavery to thus lay in these gendered and racial logics intrinsic to the very structural tendencies of capitalism in a new moment of global expansion. Hence my reference to these conditions of overseas domestic labor as new industrial slavery, because much of it was happening in new industrial nations, which I conceived as a process, of producing a new race with as yet no discernible collective identity, but existing only as a changing, floating pool of workers fulfilling class, gender, nationality, and ethnicity specifications. Today, that racialized pool of workers figures most prominently in their exponentially expanded global domestic care, food, and service work industries, that department of contemporary capital production constituted as global servitude. My understanding of the role of global servitude emerges out of a view of processes of global urbanization, the processes underlying the global fantasy of city everywhere, which I write about in an essay by the same name, as a place that is also a future fixed to the present, the ideal provision and destination of present global itineraries, the world in the works for a mobile urban humanity. These processes, which I call uber-urbanization, depend on modes of value extraction that issue out of servicing circulation itself. And by circulation, I mean not only the exchange of derivatives, currencies, goods, services, etc., but also the communicative, affective, and social activities of life activities of the valued denizens of city everywhere. That is, the activities comprising their own social reproduction. This is from the essay on City Everywhere, parts of it which I will be reading. Such modes of value extraction do not, however, only depend on the capitalizable value of life as labor for the entrepreneurial and investor subjects that comprise the ascendant global urban class. They also crucially depend on the disposable lifetimes of a worldwide servants whose primary work is to save as well as produce the valuable time of their clients or employers. That is, to serve as the means of facilitating the latter's value productive movements. I'm just showing you a couple of these. This is Manila, and this is part of what I had talked about earlier in my earlier work is the flyover network, which is supposed to be the paradigm of an archipelago, an urban archipelago, with its ability to bypass and to connect neighborhoods and to leave a floating population or a sea of underdevelopment below in the 90s. But then that has become a new global forum, a new global metropolitan platform. And expressways would be kind of paradigmatic, where connection and content are the same. And everything from all of the characteristics of these expressways were built to US standards, everything from the font to the Starbucks stops to everything. So, and I talk about the whole, feel and groove, the groove of the experience being the connection and the content together. So Uber urbanization, as I said, connection as content, content as connection. We can see the operations defining this metropolitanist enterprise in the business model exemplified by Uber, the mobile app-based transportation service connecting drivers and passengers. This software as a service business, which understands itself as a facilitator of transactions between customers and independent providers, rather than as an employer of service workers, sees to the efficient allocation of human beings and their possessions through the mediatization of urban employment. And this is, by the way, even domestic work is being Uberified, right? Chopping up traditional jobs into discrete tasks, that is, into detailed piecework assigned to people at particular instantly scheduled just-in-time or on-demand times, and setting wages and service prices by dynamic measurement of supply and demand. What has been called the Uberization or Uberification of work as a business model in other spheres means converting people's times of waiting for employment, in the case of the underemployed and laid-off workforce, and their idle times, into the work of waiting on others. Aiming for frictionless efficiency through the elimination of the inevitable slack in older, personal, bonded, as well as industrial Fordist models of service labor, including full-time, lifetime employment, the built-in features of such on-demand mobile services highlight more than the fact that a burgeoning global service economy undergirds the expansion of communicative capitalist industries, driving and shaping Uber urbanization, or the fact that the mediatization of service industries often entails technologies to facilitate the direct casualization of labor, converting what would be understood as the waste, that is unemployed people's lifetimes, or the unemployed free time of the partially employed, also times of waste, into on-demand or on-call work detail, often combined with other diverse on-demand work detail in a frenzied multitasking model of employment, meaning productive times, aimed at soaking up the liquidity of lifetimes of the urban excess, leading mobile app-based service enterprises to do something else besides directly contribute to the creation of a growing precariat in the global north. These enterprises seek to effectuate a perfect meshing of two orders of social media, technological and human. That is to say, they seek to fuse and incorporate the disaggregated, dividuated human parts of the enterprise as component media within a total integrated platform to program the function of humans as media for other humans. None of this is new in a certain sense. One could point to Taylorism as an immediate precursor of these presuppositions of new media. However, internal to the machinic, mechanizing, and technologizing tendencies of capitalist production from the industrial age on are longer legacies of the institution of slavery and colonialism, which continue to inform the dominant protocols codified in the most advanced capitalist media technologies as means of value extraction, as well as the social landscapes within which these are embedded. Here I want to point out only one striking line of lineage, which can be gleaned from the striking continuity between, on the one hand, the function of colonial slaves as the bodily instruments and tools of the sovereign agency of their masters, rather than as free workers contracted for the commodity of their labor power, and on the other, the function of non-subject humans as media in the contemporary moment, non-subject humans as media for the servicing of the demands of full subject humans, particularly in the way that such demands are met through contemporary software as service enterprises. What makes for this continuity can be gleaned from the similarity highlighted by Marx between the slave and the free wage worker as both beings for another, placed at the disposal of his owner, employer, with the difference that as a commodity, the slave is sold once and for all to his owner, while as the bearer of the commodity labor power, the free worker sells himself piecemeal. What makes for the continuity is not simply the commodification of persons, their exchange value as the condition of their sale, whether wholesale or piecemeal, but crucially also the disposition over another's vitality. Marx suggests that rather than a disjuncture between the two, the slave relation is the kernel at the core of the labor relation, with the question of time, labor as selling a temporary disposition, and the provision of legal freedom obtaining as the measures for ensuring their posited separation and difference. With the imperial democratization of the masculinist prerogative of modern freedom to sell this disposition over one's own bodily laboring capacities throughout the post-colonial world, it comes as no surprise that the seemingly anachronistic or regressive existential situation of one's whole bodily being or one's whole lifetime placed at the absolute disposal of another, figured in the slave, should find most of its spectacularized contemporary examples in feminized forms of labor, paradigmatically in the global, sexual, and domestic work industries into which migrant female workers are structurally trafficked. In the latter context, which Nandita Sharma shows to be dependent on contemporary legal mechanisms for the social organization of unfreedom, one finds the habitual exercise of the absolute disposition of employers over the domestic workers' entire bodily being or their entire time. At the beck and call of their employers for an indefinite range of tasks, live-in immigrant domestic workers in particular exemplify the job of servitude, which is to put one's vital capacities at the thorough disposal of one's employers. What I find important to note in these contexts of contemporary servitude is, however, less the model of seemingly unproductive servile labor or servility that Paulo Verno, an autonomist, sees as the new basis of a universal post-Fordist exploitation, and that in contrast I see as characteristic specifically of those lives that bear investable, accumulable value. This is a whole discussion about the difference between those who, where there's no distinction between life as labor or those who live their lives as their own form of capital, and lives of waste, which I talk about and expand elsewhere. Rather, what I find instructive for understanding the posited function of humans as media within today's urban platforms is the way live-in guest migrant domestic workers act as all-around household appliances and domestic implements whose design or designated purpose is to save their employers' valuable lifetimes. What is to be observed is precisely their function as machines for other humans' valuable life production. As Marx writes, what is characteristic about machinery, and here I want to think about machinery as it is discussed in Marx, to talk about this rather than as labor, the means of production, because I think it better enables us to understand servitude than in the subjectified forms that we already know. That what Marx says is characteristic about machinery employed in production is the saving of necessary labor and the creating of surplus labor. Like convenience foods and food services, servitude, in contrast to servility, provides, besides immeasurable social, subjective, and affective values of well-being, comfort, and self-esteem, savings in that non-material use value of time. Instead of being wasted on the chores of life maintenance, the extra time saved can then be absorbed into the higher value and valorizable lifetimes of employers. Sorry, I forgot this Uberification of platforms of labor, and the way that in the urban archipelago, global urban archipelago, the way that I see cities as metropolitan platforms, the way that they're franchises, and the something that I call city emulants, which are cities within cities that are connected by these expressways and all kinds of channels, which are not just roads but social media, all forms of mediatic channels connecting cities within cities as a form of franchise. And there's more to say about this, but the meaning of franchise as freedom, immunity, and privilege helps me to understand that what is being promised is this exemption from servitude or subjection. And that is the meaning of franchise. Legally installed even under Philippine laws, if you look at the ways that they have figured out the franchises. And this has to do with the conversion of military bases into these city ambulance, and you will see in the restructuring of these military bases the continuity between the way that the military surpluses populations and the way that the new forms of extraction are built on top of that surplusing of people and the mopping up of their lifetimes. But that's, so serving as the means of other social reproduction apart from their own, which takes place in their home countries from which they are exported, guest domestic workers have to be viewed in their aspect, as I said, as household machines, the means of life for that life as labor that is the basis of post-Fordist modes of value extraction from spheres of circulation and reproduction. Viewed this way, that is, as instrument and means of labor as life, migrant or imported domestic workers on the whole, as well as by the piece, in their capacity as individual units of life being or lifetime, can be seen to function within individual homes as well as within the broader social factory of their host societies as a kind of vital infrastructure. I'm kind of behind on my slides here, but this is the difference between servility and servitude. Servile labors, that's about the unremunerated life in the larger social factory. Servitude is this bodily vitality placed under the disposition of another. Just mentioning that the last part, the buffer zone, where global servitude is life support for the denizens of Globopolis, but you also have to connect them back to the expendable populations from which they come, because they are also life extension. Remittances, the fact that they cycle in and out of that means that their place of reproduction, that they're a crucial link in extending the lives of what would otherwise be disposable populations. So this is the difference between servers and servants in the new city everywhere. Servers, of course, are the nation states have become servers. There's a distinction that I'm making here between the servers and the servants, and servants are integrated into the total mediatic platform that is the cities. So vital infrastructure. Abdul Malik Simon has in fact importantly proposed this very notion of people as infrastructure to encapsulate when, where, and how people's very selves, situations, and bodies serve as mediums of conveyance and articulation, as, quote, conduits, routes, circuits, and pathways through which things reach, pass through, and affect each other. In the former colonial cities of the global south, such as Kinshasa, which he writes about, also Jakarta, which substantially lack more formal, ready-made, and technical forms of infrastructure for people's use, the value of an individual existence does not lie in the elaboration of a meaningful, and I would add valuable life, but instead in an individual's ability to be hooked into different daily scenarios, dramas, networks, and affiliations that provide a constant set of alternatives for how to put bread on the table or how to become a person that can be taken seriously. That's Abdul Malik Simon. As a correlate of their increasing expendability, people must bring together the particularities of their social relations, of family, kin, ethnicity, affiliation, their location and connections with their own personal character and style, and in this way become themselves the intersections where, when, and by which means opportunities and transactions for eking out some kind of living, though never enough for a valuable life, might happen. In other words, as global finance acts as a direct force of urbanization, unbundling and interlinking infrastructural projects across cities everywhere, the local urban poor must create out of their own bodily extensive selves and routines of coordinated action with others the very systems of utility provision, water, power, and networks of connection, access, and movement that they require and depend on as the infrastructural supports of their urban life. Julia Eliachar has similarly argued for understanding the locomotory bodily practices and communicative gestures of poor residents in Cairo as unrecognized forms of urban infrastructure. These social semiotic embodied practices, she argues, do not only importantly reproduce social relations of the city and hence the basis of formation of political action and identity, they also provide outcomes of economic value. The dialogic actions of gestures are a form of semiotic commons, a collective resource like a public good, whose otherwise unrestricted availability for use in the reproduction of communities has been steadily undermined and diminished by those very same kinds of forces of urbanization that I describe as the forces of city everywhere. In Cairo, these would be speculative investments on the part of Islamic companies, the army, and the state, as well as remittances also from their own migrant workers in the Gulf, which fed the rise of a bubble in real estate markets that reshaped the look and feel of Cairo. Eliachar observes how as environmental destruction, public infrastructural neglect, gentrification and forced evictions, and the dispersion of shabby Cairenes from central neighborhoods where they were once concentrated, effectively emptied out the places of shabby culture, the embodied practices through which long-standing forms of belonging and intimacy were generated and replenished that also came unhinged. Noting the severe toll that structural adjustment policies in the 1990s took on such collective resources of bodily practices, she reads the diminishment of the semiotic commons as a form of divestment, albeit unplanned, in an important, if unrecognized, form of urban infrastructure. Both Simon and Eliachar highlight the fact that life in cities in the former developing world has long depended on an innumerable array of live or vital, rather than only objectified inorganic material forms of infrastructure, which are centrally comprised of distributed, coordinated, rhythmic human capacities and social routines. Quote, complex combinations of objects, spaces, persons, and practices that have to be continually generated, repeatedly performed, endlessly negotiated, and modified, in a word, improvised, and occasionally, often periodically, revamped. It is this high level of dynamism, provisionality, and processual productivity that makes such forms of infrastructure live, as opposed to technological hardware. Right? While the specificities of the local and national histories of this informal organic development might vary, It is a shared global history of colonial relations of power that subtends the conditions of post-colonial capitalism, now shared across these urban contexts, conditions out of which forms of vital infrastructure emerge, serving not only as a coherent platform for social transaction and livelihood that has kept a perennially sinking urban excess population afloat or above water, but also as crucial supports of urban life in general. That is to say, while they are the means of reproducing the lives of disposable people, they are also the means for facilitating the circulation and movement comprising proper, that is, valued urban life. If you don't have an imagination of what some of these vital infrastructures are, you can think of everything on the streets in the global south, in the urban areas where people come in and they do things for you on the streets. Everything is moving. They're conveyance, anybody, carriers, drivers, peddlers, the whole array of people who are there facilitating connections and being couriers at any moment, carrying your bags, whatever, right? Whether locomotory and communicative bodily practices that can lubricate movement and buffer collision in a seemingly chaotic, impossible, dense traffic on the streets, or makeshift transient social networks through which illicit goods are marketed and transported or services rendered, the provisional facilitative channels created out of social collaboration and routine are the means of survival of a sector of urban humanity whose numbers have been rapidly multiplying in tandem with the aggressive growth of the urbanizing forces of their dispossession. As the forces of financial urbanization erode and diminish these life-making collaborations of the poor through the privatizing and closure of urban spaces and utilities, these same forces also ultimately effectuate the swelling of the ranks of the immiserated and expendable, and in this way paradoxically contribute to the growth of the very flexible improvisatory practices and activities of livelihood comprising people as infrastructure. This view of global servitude as consisting of mobile and shifting strata of disposable yet vital means of reproduction, not only of their host societies, but as I said, also of the very expendable populations and post-colonial states that serve as the conditions of their own reproduction, is not, however, simply an argument about the reproduction of class relations. We need to rethink the notion of means of reproduction as a mediatory agency, which allows us to see other possibilities, such as the way migrant workers, as well as the expendable populations from which they are temporarily redeemed as servants, are both manipulators of cash, as speculators, investors, and bankers, and cash themselves. That is, they are a form of soft currency that they speculate on, invest in, and gamble. To this extent, they are vanishing mediators. As a global aggregate, however, their liquidity, about which I have lots more to say, but I don't have time here today, because this is all about the production of liquidity, the very basis of the new extraction, modes of extraction under financial capital. That this production, this liquidity, is precisely a medium of capital valorization and accumulation that has disappeared from the accounts. Just as the lifetimes of entire populations are made into monetized assets that serve as risk-absorbing collateral for the speculative maneuvers on the parts of states and their banks. And you just have to think about austerity measures. When currency depreciation goes down, what is being depreciated is entire futures of populations, right, as well as presents. It's being cashed in right now. So they have become, in aggregate form, assets for states and banks. Migrant workers and their transnational networks deploy themselves as collective assets for their own survival, relying on a social calculus that is made to converge with, but is also in excess of those financial logics too easily summed up by the word neoliberalism. As creative media, their forms of social calculus consists, for example, of dividing and distributing, differentiating and allocating, but also integrating and coordinating persons and their substances and faculties, practices, and theories of social action that we miss if we adhere to uninterrogated property assumptions behind the oppositions between persons and things, humans and non-humans, subjects and objects, that continue to structure our thinking about social reproduction, as Marilyn Strathern has argued. It is these forms of coordinated capacities that enable their networks to function, and I'm talking about the social networks of many of these migrant workers. And sometimes there are divisions made between migrant workers and smugglers, but so many of them are part of similar social networks or intersecting social networks. It is these forms of coordinated capacities that enable these networks to function not only as vital infrastructure, but also as vital platforms of their own personal life ventures. These are elastic, flexible, dynamic skeins of relations with constraints and possibilities that are to some extent pre-formatted, for example, through domestic kinship protocols, etc. But they're also dynamic and changing as a result of being stretched across continental and transnational contexts and within systems over which communities have little control. And in this way, through the leverage powers that the global make available, might be said to be even in more flux than perhaps in earlier times. The difference I draw here between vital infrastructure and vital platforms is not a technical distinction as much as a theoretical political one. Vital infrastructure allows us to see when and how people's mediating capacities become a part of the built environment, in the way the means of circulation, whether they're roads, communicative media, currencies, mobile banking, enables the movement and possibility of exchange, therefore as part of the process of capitalist reproduction. Vital platforms allows us to see when and how people's mediating capacities becomes a part of the machinery of industry, technologies of production, participating in the process of valorization as a means of production of capital. It is in this latter aspect that overseas migrant workers can be viewed as agents of their own liquid lifetimes, processing foreign exchange transaction between discrepantly valued life currencies, between their families, their employers, right? They're doing foreign exchange, basically. According to flexible exchange rates that their own significant remittances, as the Philippine economy's second most important source of foreign exchange earnings affect. So they are also upholding the Philippine state. The complaint that they are sometimes used by their own relatives as ATMs, that's always the running joke, right? As well as their entrepreneurial investments in their home country, and you talk to any domestic worker, migrant worker, and ask them what kind of investments they have. They do not only invest in business opportunities, but they invest in their children, they invest in the reproduction of the servant class in many ways, right? This demonstrates their role as both currency and bank, investor and asset. Like the expendable communities that they are redeemed from and that they support, they act as at once manipulators of liquidity and liquid assets themselves. That is, as I said, the vanishing mediators of a plethora of value-producing exchanges. It comes then as no wonder that as a global aggregate, their liquidity acts as precisely a means of capital valorization. And this is what I want to use as the basis of a claim that it is this powerful role of the strata of disposable peoples that is really a subaltern driver of global urbanization, as opposed to the accounts where they're always the effect, that they're, and then they are. But I think this is a crucial view of them that's important for us to restore. And it is this view of them as a subaltern driver of global urbanization that is critically as well as hegemonically bypassed, even as creative strategies of bypass are some of the key forms of disposable people's social survival and striving. So I just want to conclude on a note on theoretical historical bypass. So there's another global, this time time fantasy, that complements the drive to uber urbanization in the global space fantasy of city everywhere. This fantasy is a history that traces the evolutionary shift away from the liberal humanist subject, constructed on the basis of homeostasis and equilibrium, a self-possessing, self-regulating being with agency, desire, or will of its own, to the cybernetic post-human, constructed on the basis of privileging information over embodiment, pattern over presence, as a form of a distributed cognition located in disparate parts that may be in only tenuous communication with one another. That's Catherine Hale's How We Became Post-Human. Right? I want to suggest that there are genealogies that are bypassed in this provincial Euro-American account of how information lost its body. I mean, my whole talk is how it didn't lose its body. Its body is in this entire global strata of servitude, right? And how we became post-human. Genealogies already implicit in the global history of colonialism and slavery, to which I alluded earlier. These are genealogies that, at least in my account, feminist ethnographic work on South and South Asia, Southeast Asian, and Melanesian social worlds is enabling us to better understand and explore. So, for example, the work of Fenella Cannell on the social cultural logics of people who have nothing in Bicol, Philippines, provides one alternative genealogical path to a shared but also different global present, that is the information age, which the information age is seen by Catherine Hales as following Frederick Jameson as kind of the purest form of capitalism, that when information loses its body. But Catherine Hales sees this, this information age as this emerging substrata that is shifting underneath us, that's pushing us to the theoretic view of ourselves as post-human. It's her explanation for deconstruction, for a lot of the theoretical shifts, including, Deleuze and Guattari, postcolonial, everything is explained by this emerging substrata, right? In Cannell's account of spirit possession, mediumship, faith practices, transgender beauty contests, and sharecropping, among others, as bodily instantiations, not just idioms, but sensorial physical enactments of worlds in which persons are potentially changeable in every interaction with others. We're far from the homeostatic conditions of ambiguity. We're far from homeostatic conditions of ambiguity, tension, and uncertainty characterize all exchanges and their sequels. This very high dynamism of interactions. And she has a whole account for why this lasts throughout Spanish and American colonialism. And persons become, as it were, their own mediatory objects, in a place accustomed to the convertibility and substitutability between persons and things, where forms of social personal being, which a Western bourgeois property-oriented analytical view might want to call identity, is largely conducted through the making and remaking of potentially transformative relationships with others, particularly as asymmetric relationships with human and supernatural superiors, who moreover remain resolutely plural. That's Fenella Cannell. In such analytical descriptions, and she's describing the social logics within which people are in relationships of help, where it's very hard to distinguish between help and predatory lending, right? That this whole dynamic social logic, I read also the very conditions of virtuality understood to have emerged as the cultural effects of the information age. Such conditions are to be gleaned as well in the analytical attention of other scholars to the way that persons are imagined and behave as individuals. This is a term, by the way, that came from some South Asian work. Now we all talk about individuality. And as derivatives of plural social relations, terms that have also been used to characterize the post-human world. Cannell's and Hale's books were published the same year, 1999. One was writing within the category concept of culture, the other within that of cultural production. Both, in effect, looking for what Gayatri Spivak calls the chains of value coding, underwriting differentiated sites within a broader imperial formation. with the anthropologist Colonial, seeking the value coding of a particular, that was national, regional, area, cultural formation, and then of course the literary theorist seeking the value coding of a general, that's its global cultural formation. But to me, they are both seeking this value coding, right? Now, one need not contest that the information age is the age of finance capital, nor that this is the material context for the visibility or theoretical apprehensibility of codes as the forces of production of beings, human and non-human, social and technological, everything from DNA to programming to cellular automata, right? This is the paradigmatic figure for reading in these times. One can, however, broaden that context and the implicit timeline of the narrative, which I see as the autobiography of capital written by its bearers, within which the generalization of writing as inscriptive coding can be understood as a material force. This is the theoretic view that confirms that capital-intensive technological development is the motor force of history, is the the motor force of evolution. Right? So this is perhaps where an inquiry into low capital, non-efficient, labor-intensive human media might come in, where an archaeology of defunct, informal, low-tech, cheap, human-based, but not solely or exclusively human mediatic forms operate. Undoubtedly, my understanding of vital platforms and the archaeology I propose, with human media as its focus, is a political heuristic intended to bring to the fore the living memories of slavery and colonialism, pre-colonial debt bondage and sociality, as concomitant with the evolutionary transformation of the liberal humanist subject in the age of freedom into the post-human subject in the age of computation, 2 ages in the history of global capital. In a more expanded view of human media, I have tried to trace an itinerant line away from, but also a transitional part of this mediatic history in colonial, post-colonial Philippines in the 20th century. And this is where I tried to think about what the colonial apparatuses that were installed by the U.S. Colonial government were for making Filipinos from savages and natives into subjects of citizen man as they prepared the Philippines for independence, right? And this, everything from the apparatuses of the apparatuses such as the short story, taught Filipinos how to write the short story, and the institution of mass education, were apparatus to create the social and sensorial bases for the expansion of capital. That is, free subjects whose integral whole selves are realized in the object of their activities, subjects as indivisible, single entities and single authors of what they make and do, defined against the world of things. In contrast, you can see the persistence of older practices of social negotiation and habitation, older cognitive and aesthetic receptions, incapacities of humans as media that are denigrated as non-human. And this is a whole discussion of the way that the natives were denigrated because they were like robots or gramophones, that they only had mimetic capacities, they had no creativity, there was no soul, there was nothing there. They're all surface, they just were surface inscriptions too. And Denise da Silva calls this also in another context subjects of affectability rather than the transparent subject. But just as an example, you can I called migrant Filipino jazz musical performers that are coursing through the Southeast Asia world as vital platforms of socio-technical reproducibility. And why did I do that? These were performers, who could mimic exact renditions, voice, texture, everything of American jazz and Latin American jazz, right? They became kind of the cheap software, hardware that was traveling around Asia, in effect being transmitters of a form of musical modernity in Southeast Asia. But it was these exacting bodily mimetic capacities, that could register, perform, notate, they could orally absorb and do playback. This is why I saw them as analog technologies, because they could take in and then do a playback. These were capacities that were denigrated from the side of citizen man, from liberal humanist subject. And yet they were practically valued and exploited. Indeed, they were effectively treated as technical capacities of analog reproduction. And so like the camera, the phonograph, the gramophone, there's much more to say about this, but they were medically capacious machines, which make Tausig attest to the regeneration and refunctioning of the mimetic faculty in the age of technological reproducibility. I won't say much more about that, but there's a longer argument about how this also becomes a point at which we have political rupture in the late 80s and 90s with some of the political events that also had to do with radios and cell phones in the Philippines. But what I wanted to just point out is this way that they are enacting a form of mobility and facilitating a form of circulation that appear in contrast with, but they're really participating in the mobility and circulation enabled by and representative communicative technologies of an expanding global capitalist modernity. So I will just end with saying that while these, what I want you to think about is the way that as they were serving in similar ways to the phonograph and gramophone, about how they served as the media of reproduction and media of circulation of desires and affects in an emergent global communication system, what kind of purloined transmissions were being affected? To not see that their transmissions were solely on behalf or for capital, that there were all kinds of transmissions that are lost and also have other kinds of effects in genealogies. So it is not just the failure, but the evasion of colonial disciplining through humanist values, that extension of humanity through imperial benevolence, that is the result and condition of people's efforts to reinvent and creatively persist in practices of social reproduction, deemed obsolescent under changing conditions of life established by the new colonial, soon-to-be global regime of U.S. power and capital. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Neferti.
Hey, Helen. Nice to see you.
Here at our campus. Welcome. So I really appreciated your retrospective and going back to like Imelda Kunzeandai's work and kind of going through your past projects. And so I mean, as one of your former students, I definitely get like your feminist investment and the genealogy that you laid out. I was wondering though, kind of like when you linked feminization and domestic labor and reproduction, if there's a space in which to address Filipino migrant men and masculinity kind of within that, the sphere of reproduction and that kind of labor, because of the way that, for example, migrant men or seamen also like contribute to the reproduction of that class that you're talking about. And then, so I have some other thoughts. So I'm thinking about masculinity and reproduction. And also I was wondering if you thought about like cruise ships as another site in which to think about where feminine bodies and the masculine migrant worker kind of meet, and also the way that those elite folks from global cities are in the cruise ships, where now there are a lot of Filipino migrants working in tourism and as the cabin cleaners and servers and so on. So there's that one piece, and then also thinking about the infrastructure in the Philippines and what you talked about with regard to the militarization and the former bases and so on. I don't know if you're aware, but like in Olongapo, they also started building a shipbuilding site, whereas shipbuilding is normally like in Korea, and so I think it's a Hanjin site that's right there in Subic Bay. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering if you would be able to address like seafaring and shipping as part of the infrastructure of globalization and all the sort of things that you're talking about, even as I really appreciate what you laid out for us in terms of like the feminist genealogy.
Well, you know, I think from the start, if you notice, I don't talk about feminization. I talk about global servitude. And the fact that I'm not talking about subjects, it has, to me, you know, I was motivated precisely by this inordinate attention to women, you know, and I'm really, you know, this is, and the fact that I'm talking about rhythmically coordinated capacities means that I am not talking about gendered subjects. I'm talking about the disaggregation and coordination of many capacities. So, which is all to say that I don't see this through the rubric of feminization of labor. Servitude to me is not feminization of labor. I mean, you can say feminization of labor if you understand that this isn't about women's work. It is about what's denigrated as servitude, which is not gendered as women's work in the global arena. So all the examples that I gave you of, you know, people watch your car boys, you know, there's masculinities all around. That's all part of the global servitude, the strata of global servitude. That's very important to me. It's very important for me to signal, you know, that what I'm talking about isn't encapsulated by anything like women's work or anything, you know, so when I was talking about the mediatic capacities in Uber, you know, these are drivers, they're men, they're women. So this isn't the level at which I am looking at any of this, at the level of subjects. So which is to say that actually I do know about Olongapo. I write about these military bases and the way that they become platforms for investment. And there's manufacturing and there's all kinds of investment that's going on. Infrastructure building, who's building these buildings? Who's building entire, you know, condominiums, hotels, ships, whatever they are. There's plenty of infrastructure building and it is not confined to women. It's confined to a whole array of workers. But to me, the way to see these is not to see it through the category of labor. That's what I said from the outset. If we think about it through the category of labor, then we think about it through subjects. You know, I mean, at least in that kind of way that we think about labor as being subjects who do work, subjects from who can alienate their labor power and build things. So what I was really looking at is these capacities, all kinds of capacities that are displayed. And so also not to think about there are seafarers, but seafarers are connected to domestic workers, are connected to the people back home who have no jobs. It's the elastic skeins among all of these different peoples who are kin, extended, whatever, you know, their social networks that are of interest to me. And those to me are vital platforms. That's why I have moved away from the language of labor. To talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't trying to say that I did see that you were signaling that when you were referring to like drivers and so on, and so I appreciate like you elaborating on that.
But the sea is a very important part of this, which I haven't fully developed, but it is the relationship between liquidity and these seas that are traversed and these islands, right? This whole paradigm to me is really worthy of further exploration. And your own work on on seamen, right? On seafarers, I think is an important part of such a project in which we understand the kinds of infrastructure. Shipping is infrastructure. Shipping is what brings one thing to another place. It's, you know, when you do shipping, these are channels for exchanges, these are channels for bringing things to one place to another, and they're very much part of this uber-urbanization that goes across the seas. But the sea is also where there are no borders, there's nothing to hang on to. It is also the site of extreme dispossession and the refugees right now, those people who are crossing the seas, this becomes kind of the fate of where people are jettisoned because they are not part of this polynucleated urban world. which is about privilege dwelling rather than lives of waste, which can only fill in the sea. I think, you read your name?
Okay. Thank you very much for that very fascinating talk. I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of the concepts you've been using and employing. And one question that I did want to ask goes to near your conclusion when you talked about bypass and as a theoretical concept and as a sort of critical intervention into some of the language of post-humanism that's circulating, and how that critical conception of the post-human is so underpinned by these often invisible social networks that are not accounted for in that theorization. And so my question really gets to thinking about what might be at stake in accounting for these. Often this sort of constitutive other of this critical the critical rhetoric of the post-human and the non-human to some extent, and in terms of, for instance, the way in a lot of Marxist rhetoric today, there's all the use of accelerationism as a concept, and how that seems to sort of privilege a certain notion of labor in the developed world without really accounting for them, how that's underpinned by these larger global transnational social networks, and what might it look like to rethink something like a concept of Virnow's multitude, or Hart and Negri's concept of the multitude, when it's not centered on when for instance the model of Uberization accounts for what that looks like outside of, say, the imperial centers of the metropoles of the world. That makes sense.
I guess what I'm trying to do is not to, supplement what was excluded.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say, oh, this history of post-humanism, just didn't exclude the rest of the world, which it did, but I don't think that that's the point at which I want to stay. I want to say that there is a political cost to that. There's a political cost in terms of trying to explain how we got here, what this here is, and what it consists of, right? And so in thinking about vital platforms, what I'm trying to point to is the political importance and surplus of the surplus.
Right.
That this disposable populations and what becomes fodder for the liquidity that becomes the basis for the accumulation of astronomical value in the current moment. On a scale that people just don't even have the mathematical abilities to imagine, right? That is also driven by this intense creativity and intense dynamism that is, which is the means of reproduction of this entire, city everywhere, right? So vital platforms becomes not so much like this excluded thing. It's included.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the thing about Uber urbanization is that it doesn't depend on it depends on deep inclusion.
Yeah.
That all kinds of economic policies are about the deep inclusion of the unbanked and the poor, right? That all of these technologies are about mopping up all the liquid lifetimes of everybody, and no one will be apart from this. But when you see it from that side, what you're seeing is a technologically driven view of capital as a motor force. That you don't see that what has also depended on, and what it still depends on, is something that it cannot fully contain. That there is the potential of antagonism and assault that's everywhere, which is why we're in such a crazy world. Because all these refugees, all of these excess, they can't control all of the possibilities of this liquidity, which can take an assaultive form at any given moment, right? But it's not just an assaultive form. As a feminist, I want to point out both the antagonism, but also the possibilities of what future life, or what life could be like, or what life is like now. the life that is for survival, the life that people generate precisely so that they can survive, that it is inventing ways of living that we should be paying attention to, instead of saying, lamenting the death of the liberal humanist subject or the death of whatever, that these have long been a site of creative, but it's always denigrated, always set to the side, and always abandoned and seen as a site of nature. And that's how capitalism in the current moment reinvents itself, because it doesn't have to pay attention to the social reproduction of any of these populations. They just go and, and they invent all ways of reproducing themselves, but then it comes in and subsumes that social reproduction, that life, that vitality.
It does seem to like produce a very different conception of how we might imagine futurity as opposed to futurity in the standard language of post-humanism in that sense.
It might lead us to imagine the present differently,
Right, yeah.
and the past. It might lead us to be able to think differently about, this is a perceptual exercise. This is an exercise in seeing the world differently now, and different from and the stories we tell about it that have, that hamper us from figuring a way out.
That's an amazing talk and incredibly rich. I'm curious to hear you say a little bit more kind of directly about liquidity. You refer to it constantly in the Q&A as well. I think of, having learned from Karen Ho, faculty member here, to think of liquidity as a capacity of the powerful, right? They are able to reinvent themselves and resituate themselves and deal with any crisis by being, in a sense, liquid, and that the illiquidity is the burden of the less powerful and the less wealthy. But you're describing global servitude as having having liquidity. So
Not having, being liquid.
So yeah, explain just a little bit what you're
Well,
thinking.
liquidity refers to the convertibility of things, convertibility into cash, the convertibility of assets into cash, the speed with which you can do convertibility. So when I'm talking about liquidity, I am also talking about the way people are able to do these fast transactions, but at the level of petty cash. So there is liquidity, there's about the scale and magnitude is important here. I mean, the liquidity that Karen Ho is talking about, the liquidity that hedge fund managers manage, etc. These are enormous aggregates, enormous assets, right? We're talking, as I said, entire populations, So liquidity, to me, is the mode in which people transact, on a daily basis to survive. Often, sometimes, trading their own lives for a little cash so that they can get another day of life. So there are these ways that you are trading in currencies, but the currencies aren't all the hard currencies of dollars and national currencies. The currencies could be many kinds of things. It could be your time, your body, your sisters, whatever. Right? There are many currencies that are being converted constantly, or leverage, or as I said, there is something. If you look at what the studies of slums, you can see all the evidence of the petty financialization of life there long before any of this financialization of life under neoliberalism. It's like that's the way that people lived, the way that they transacted. Anything was convertible. You could make lots of conversions. So to me, liquidity refers to this speed of conversions, right, that is going on. Now, at the top level, at financial level, you have scale, you have speed that's like of another magnitude as well, and you have hard currencies. We're talking about the yen, the renminbi, the dollar, right? These are hard currencies that can store value. They are the measure of value. Soft currencies can never hold value. They are liquid precisely to the extent that they are never the general equivalents. They can't serve as the measure of other values. They can only they can only result in what Marx calls the dead end of exchange, the dead end of, once you pay your cash, etc. So the dead end in consumption, which is the consumption of your life, the consumption of your time, etc. So liquidity to me doesn't belong to strata. It's not a characteristic of classes. It is the phenomenon on which capitalist valorization in the current moment depends, rather than on the manufacture of goods. That's still a part of it. Yeah.
I wish we had more time,
Sorry.
but we don't. And that was fantastic. So please.
Thank you.